Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome all of you to the latest edition of the WIRES webinar series. And we're very lucky today to have with us Matt Christiansen from the FERC General Counsel's office. He is currently the General Counsel at FERC. I'll give you a brief introduction to Matt. He's a graduate of Columbia and Yale Law School. He's a former law clerk to DC Circuit Judge Stephen Williams, who I had the pleasure of appearing before a number of times when I was in the appellate office at FERC. Matt worked in the office of the General Counsel at the Commission before he went up in 2017 to be an advisor to then Commissioner Rich Glick. Continued on with him when he became chairman briefly before he was appointed by Chairman Glick in, I think, very early February to the position of General Counsel at FERC. We're really lucky to have Matt here with us today to talk a little bit about his experience and his views on some of the issues on transmission matters that the industry is dealing with. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Matt, give him an opportunity to provide some opening comments or remarks, and then we'll follow up with questions. And I have some for him, but certainly for anybody who's watching the program, if you have any questions that you'd like for Matt to address, please use the question function, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. Put that in, and I'll be happy to go through those with Matt as they come in. I'm hoping we have a lot of questions for him today from our group. He's a perfect person to deal with a lot of these issues. We're really looking forward to hear from him. So Matt, let me go ahead and turn it over to you, and then we'll follow up after you get done with your opening comments.
Okay, thank you, Larry. I'll try and go through these couple comments as quickly as possible because I actually much prefer the back and forth of the question and answer to me droning on for 10 or 15 minutes. But all the same, I promise a few opening comments, I'll go through them. Larry suggested that two things that would be worth talking about are one, the role of the General Counsel at FERC, and then two, some of the Commission's current priorities. The one I'll focus on, which is I think top of mind for a lot of people right now, certainly where I spend most of my time, but also particularly for this group, is transmission and what the Commission is thinking about with respect to potential transmission reforms in the months and years ahead. But before I turn to that, let me just go quickly through the General Counsel's office. I'm admittedly biased here, but I think General Counsel at FERC and the General Counsel's office at FERC in particular are respectively the best job at the agency and maybe the best office anywhere in DC to practice. Again, I recognize my obvious bias there, but the General Counsel's office is sort of uniquely positioned in the sense that it's more so than any other office at FERC, you get to work on everything that the agency does, literally everything. I mean, there's almost no matter of significance that doesn't have the General Counsel's office involved in some respect. You get to see a really broad range of things, but then, and that's obviously one of the best things of working at FERC, full stop, but then the General Counsel in particular is a really fun, and also I think rewarding position because you get to sort of be both part of staff, and I think typically, certainly it's the case with this chairman, you also sort of get to be part of the 11th floor, and you get to be, in many respects, an advisor directly to the chairman while also keeping one foot on staff and seeing the way orders are developed, seeing the way memos are developed, working on all the recommendations. So you really, in a sense, sit at an intersection between Commission staff and then, well, what is currently virtually the 11th floor. So in that sense, it's really, that's part of what makes it such a fun position for me, obviously, is that you see a broad range of things. You see all the substantive stuff that goes into the Commission. And then you also get to provide legal advice, even outside the context of order development, whether it's litigation advice, whether it's thinking through, big, interesting topics such as, we've had a number of constitutional questions that are sort of uniquely the province of the General Counsel's office and the General Counsel in particular to sort of counsel the commissioners on, the chairman in particular. And then even some of the more mundane stuff too, like General Counsel's office, and then this rises to the General Counsel as well, tend to do a lot of back and forth with the Commissioner's office on things like ethics and recusals and things like that. So you really have an opportunity to talk and work closely, not just with staff, but with the Commissioner's offices too. And that is, I think, that is in a real sense what makes the job so fun and why it's simultaneously exhausting, but also really. It's a little bit different than I think a General Counsel's position often is in a large company, just because it is there's such a substantive policy role, in addition to helping to manage the organization and provide all the sort of traditional services. I think it continues to feel a lot like drinking from a fire hose, but drinking from a really rewarding fire hose. That quite finishes out the metaphor, but it's been a lot of fun so far and a steep learning curve. With that, I think maybe I'll go to transmission. And this, as I said, this is the topic that I spend almost most of my time on right now. This is the thing that most of my conversations with Rich center on right now. And I think that's no surprise. I think it was maybe a couple weeks ago that Rich said that transmission is the sexy topic right now in the energy world. And someone commented that that's a very particular view of sexy. But it is definitely the topic that I feel like people are focused on the most, and people recognize that this is a moment where what the commission does on transmission is both really important and likely to have effects for the world. Rich has said that he hopes that the commission will come forward with some sort of plan or vision or proposal on transmission at some point this summer. So I'm not breaking any news there, but it's definitely, it is the focus within the building. And I think it's the focus within the building for a couple of different reasons. The chief one being that the stakes are just really, really high. I think this is also something Rich has said publicly as well. Again, I'm not stepping out, but there is virtually no chance of meeting state greenhouse gas emissions targets without a significant expansion of the transmission system. And that's even putting aside whether or not we get federal targets at some point, which would be even harder to meet, I think, without a significant expansion of the transmission system. And that itself is even putting aside goals on electrification, which will only make transmission and a reliable, resilient electricity supply that much more important. The other half of that I think doesn't get that much attention is that as we see more and more of the early impacts of climate change, transmission is going to be increasingly important in managing those impacts. Again, I think I'm probably preaching to the converted with this group, but if you just look at what happened earlier this year with Winter Storm Uri, the regions that had, and this is a true heuristic, but I think it largely holds true, the regions that had a developed transmission system with access to a diverse range of resources did much, 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 much better than the regions that didn't. And that doesn't mean you build transmission at all costs, but when you look at what the economic costs were just over that 1 to 2 week period, that single event would justify a significant, by itself, would justify a significant investment in transmission. So the stakes are high. The other side is it's been a long time since the commission has revisited its transmission regulations. Order 890, I'm sure this is all stuff this group is familiar with, but Order 890 was issued, I believe it was 2007. And then Order 1000 was, I believe, 2011. So a 4-year gap. Now it's been 10 years since Order 1000 was issued. I think Order 1000 made some progress. It obviously wasn't perfect. I think there are probably some people who would suggest it was significantly short of perfect. But irrespective, it's been a while since the commission has returned in a major way to its transmission regulations. And given the importance of transmission, given the sort of inflection point that we may be at with respect to efforts to both mitigate and adapt to climate change, this seems like a really important time to take a hard look at transmission. I'm happy to talk just about anything transmission related when we get to the question and answer session, so I won't try and do an exhaustive thesis on transmission, but what I will say is I think where we are right now, which is I think at the beginning of what is probably going to be a historic investment in the transmission infrastructure. There are a couple things that are really important to think through. And I think these are ideas that can guide a range of different reforms. And there are probably going to be people who disagree vigorously about what the best way to address each of these ideas are. But I do think these are, in my view at least, these are the key questions as we think through, as the commission thinks through what set of reforms make the most sense. And the first one is, how are we going to identify transmission needs? Obviously, Order 1000 had a very focused approach on identifying particular types of needs, and each transmission planning region came up with their own process for identifying those needs. But particularly as we make long, as we as a country, and I guess other companies in particular, make what should be really long-term investments, and investments that are both designed to change the generation mix in part and to deal with a very rapidly changing load profile, resource mix, all of those things. How do you identify those longer-term needs, and how do you ensure that assets that are designed to last for several decades are designed in a way that identify needs as far as possible into that lifespan? And I don't know that we're going to ever successfully identify what the transmission needs are in 2075, but we can think beyond what the transmission needs are in 2025. And how do you do that in a way that is predictable, reliable, justifiable, all of those things that I think are big questions. Every bit is important, perhaps more important for the purposes of litigation, which is what my office focuses on, addressing judicial review, is how do you identify who's going to pay for it? And this is, I don't mean to suggest this is some breathtaking insight that we're going to have to spend time thinking about who pays for transmission. Obviously, cost allocation is always one of the chief issues that's litigated, whether it be with respect to generic transmission reforms or often individual projects. But I do think it's going to be really, really important now for a couple of reasons. One of which is, as we look towards sort of transmission needs that, again, this is sort of extend across a longer period, how do you identify who the beneficiaries are of those needs? It's more complicated than sort of a reliability need that meets, or a project that meets a short-term reliability need in a discrete area. Obviously, if we're going to be building out the transmission system in a significant way, that's going to mean more money. It may very well be more money that, or maybe the costs may very well be less than the benefits, but anytime the price tag is high, even justifiably high, that's going to raise the stakes around who pays for it. So I think there'll be even more scrutiny on cost allocation than maybe there haven't been in the past. And then sort of related to that, but slightly different, is with respect to siting. Obviously, the states predominantly, overwhelmingly have control over transmission siting, and a very real concern of UCs, governors, whoever is involved in siting is going to be what the citizens of their state are ultimately pay for the infrastructure that's sited within their state. And again, I think that's going to be true even if the benefits that that infrastructure provides significantly outweigh the costs. Those costs are not negligible, and so they will be a significant factor, I think, in a lot of cases when it comes to whether the projects really get the permits and certificates and what have you that they need to actually get built and enter service. And then sort of related to that is, how do we ensure that customers are going to get their money for it out of transmission? Again, I feel like I've said it 3 or 4 times now, but it is worth underscoring. I'm a believer that the benefits of transmission, the vast majority of transmission anyway, significantly outweigh the costs. And that it's not just, you can't be measured just in terms of avoided reliability violations, adjusted production costs, but the option value that transmission provides, resilience benefit that transmission provides, renewable integration benefit that transmission provides, all of which will only become more important as we electrify other sectors, are substantial, and will ultimately, likely, more often than not, perhaps significantly more often than not, outweigh the costs of those facilities. But even so, I do think there is sort of a concomitant obligation on the Commission's part to ensure that customers are getting their money's worth out of those facilities and getting as much value as they possibly can. To me, that's core to the Commission's, core to the Commission's consumer protection mandate, which really is the reason the Commission was created in the first place. So I think even as we look at to a build out of the system and try and figure out how we're going to build out that system, I think it will serve the Commission well to keep as many stakeholders involved in supporting reforms to keep that focus on how do customers get their money's worth. And I do think it ultimately will enable, maybe this is rose-colored glasses, but if customers feel that they really are getting their money's worth, there's going to be more political support to make the kind of investments in transmission that I think are necessary to decarbonize, to electrify, and to ensure a reliable supply of electricity. So for me, those three issues: how do you identify the transmission needs, how do you decide who's going to pay for them, and how do you ensure that the people that are paying for those needs are getting their money's worth, are the three big topics associated with transmission that I sort of spend my time thinking about. And I do think those are three focuses that are shared throughout the Commission and across the various Commissioners' offices. So that's sort of my initial framing. I'm happy, Larry or others, if there are specific questions about transmission that we want to talk about, I'm happy to get right into that or talk about whatever.
Well, great. Thanks, Matt. I really appreciate that. You definitely are preaching to the choir on quite a bit of that, certainly in terms of the recognition of the need for a lot of transmission investment, particularly to meet the clean energy goals that have been set, but for other reasons as well, reliability, resilience, and electrification, of course. And same thing with your comments about generally the benefits associated with the transmission investment. So certainly not going to get any argument, I think, from many of the WIRES members or from me on those points. And I'm glad to hear you're spending, you personally are devoting as much time on transmission as it sounds like you are, particularly given the significance of this topic and what seems to be the priority of it with respect to the chairman, and I think actually the rest of the commissioners as well.
Yeah, I think that's true too.
Which leads me to one of the questions I have, and I've gotten this from somebody already too, which is, so Chairman Glick has mentioned a number of times, and I think increasingly recently, about coming out with some sort of a roadmap associated with transmission. I heard him at one point tick off about 6 or 7 different transmission topics that he thinks are going to need to be tackled. He's talked about, sort of coming up with a level of prioritization between low-hanging fruit, middle level, and then, harder or longer term issues to deal with. But it's generally been always in the context of coming out with a roadmap. So naturally, that's piqued everyone's curiosity as to what is this roadmap going to be? When are we going to see it? He seems to have talked about it in terms of this summer. I think people are figuring maybe that's the end of July or something like that. What light can you shed on the roadmap notion? And even if there's a sense, is this something that's more procedural versus something that, or is it going to be something that's going to be much more substantive early on? Anything like that, I think, would be of interest to me and our members to hear about.
I mean, it's I think the biggest question right now. What exactly FERC will do? I'm going to be a little bit coy about it because I don't want to get ahead of the chairman. Obviously, that's my whole job, is not getting ahead of the chairman, or a big part of my job. And also, it's not just Rich that's going to issue the roadmap. Like, he needs to work with his colleagues and get the votes and see where everyone settles. And I don't want to get too far ahead of that process. What I will repeat, though, is stuff that Rich has already said publicly, which is that, yes, his hope is to get something out this summer. And what I think he wants to do is provide some indication of what the issues are that he thinks the commission really needs to solve, and just to sort of set the terms of the debate so that all interested stakeholders, and I assume that means everyone represented on this call, can start really weighing in on what those key issues are and discussing what works, what doesn't work, why certain suggestions might be right, why certain suggestions might be wrong. So I think that that's going to be the goal. Again, in terms of the actual substance, I can't get into the specifics, but we have a joke amongst the former, well, I guess I'm now the only former GLIC advisor, amongst the current GLIC advisors and myself, which is there's always a dissent for that, given how many things Rich wrote while he was a commissioner. And I think a lot of the seeds are the seeds of what he cares about now. You can see in those statements he wrote as a commissioner, and they're things like, how do you reliably and efficiently integrate renewables? How do you set up, like as I said, how do you set up a planning process that can identify not just the transmission needs of today, but also the transmission needs in the past, and how do you ensure that investments that are being made now are sort of as cost effective, not just in the moment in the sense that they're the lowest cost that meets the discrete need identified, but also that they're the right investment over a longer period of time. I think those are examples of the type of thing that I know he's interested in, but I also, knowing Rich, I know that he very much wants to have a robust record and to hear from all sides on this, that he's of the belief that the correct, best, optimal, what have you, public policy is going to be the one that the commission develops after engaging with everyone. I know that sounds a little bit like motherhood and apple pie, that we should talk to all stakeholders, but I know that that is deeply rooted in Rich's psyche and his approach to particularly these big issues. So I mean, there are a lot of goals wrapped up in there, but starting a debate and making sure that he can hear from everyone on those particular issues that are important to him. I think that's maybe the priority number one of the roadmap that he's described.
Well, thanks. I want to pick up on one thing I thought I heard you say, though, which was you acknowledge that, it's not going to be just Rich, it's going to be his colleagues as well. And you mentioned something about making sure that, he has the votes for whatever. So is that, you do think it's going to be something that's going to be a voting item, at least, that would wind up coming out of this?
I don't know if it'll be a formal voting item or not. I do think that good strategy would be that you are at least you've at least had a conversation with all the people that will eventually vote on anything significant, because nothing can happen without, nothing changes to regulations requirements obviously can happen without a commission vote. So, and I know this is something Rich is doing, in fact, he might be doing it at this exact moment, is talking with his colleagues and seeing where the areas of agreement are, and perhaps more importantly, where the areas of disagreement are, so that they can work on those and see what could potentially command support of the majority of the commission.
Well, so speaking of strategy along the lines of whatever is going to be moving forward, looking backward on what the lessons learned may have been from past major efforts, whether it's the efforts on Order 1000 or even going way back to Order 888, for instance, or Order 890 was somewhere in between. But that's kind of almost the spectrum, I think, of generally how these things are viewed. 888, I think, was largely viewed as very successful, big effort to do a reshaping of the industry. 890 was less ambitious, but I think, generally be viewed fairly favorably. Order 1000, on the other hand, probably not so much.
Yeah.
What do you think, looking at all of those, what do you think the big lessons learned about the approach that the commission took on those, and how can that be applied to what the chairman and the commission is looking at doing today to try to make sure that you have a successful effort?
It's an excellent question. And again, knowing Rich, I know it is an important question to Rich, because it's something that he and I have talked about a great deal. I think there are probably a lot of different lessons one could draw from the last, 15, 20, 25 years, but the last 10 years in particular. Some sort of big picture, some small. I think one big picture lesson is that there has to be a focus on how the industry actually works, what works in practice. If you read Order 1000, I've actually done a couple times, and it's a long read, but if you read the whole, it all just, you nod your head, and it makes sense in a lot of different places, and yet it didn't lead to, I think, the type of build out of regional transmission planning and a lot of things that the people that drafted Order 1000 intended. And I think my personal view, just speaking only for myself, and I should say everything I say is only for myself. But just to underscore that here, I think there was less emphasis on how does it actually work in practice. And this is and again, I know I'm preaching the converted here, but this is a real industry where things actually have to get built, and regulations that sound perfect but don't lead to the type of transmission development you hope for really aren't worth that much. So I think that's one, a real focus on what works in practice. And I think that, again, to sort of beat a dead horse here, that's why it's so important to talk to stakeholders, including everyone on this call, again, because your companies all have experience actually developing transmission and getting insights into what works, because I think it has to be a really important focus for whatever the commission does. And I don't mean to impugn the people who worked on Order 1000, because there were people who have been mentors to me, and they're really, really smart people. But I think one of the things that's slightly different is Order 1000 had to tie a really had to have a really tight story, because the case on appeal of Order 1000 that the commission won, South Carolina Public Service Commission, really endorsed a strong view of what the commission's planning authority was, and what the commission's cost allocation authority was, in a way that I don't think was clear pre-Order 1000. So the theoretical basis to survive judicial review had to be really, really tight there. I think now the commission has that precedent in hand. It can be, it can focus a little bit more on the practical effects, with a little bit less of an eye towards what is the absolute best thing to do to set us up for judicial review, which I think, for good reason, was one of the big focuses. But I think that's probably the biggest lesson that I draw there. I think one other one, though, is Order 1000 was very principles-based. And I think it kicked a lot to the compliance filing, and that's good in a lot of respects, because you want government regulations that provide flexibility. But I do think one lesson that I personally thought may have been, I don't want to say there was too much flexibility, but the principles may have been a little bit vague, such that they didn't really get and produce implementation that I think some of the drafters of those principles hope for. But I do think there was some value in being a little more specific, a little more prescriptive in some ways, to ensure that whatever happens, not knowing exactly what it is, but whatever happens, gets the results that commissioners who vote for it hope that it will.
Well, great. And one other question I have, which is sort of a kind of a FERC big picture question, which is, I think it's great you're focusing so much on transmission. And I think there's a lot of attention at the commission on that issue, but we know that's not the only issue by any stretch that they're dealing with. And one of the questions is, how do you manage, or what are your concerns about trying to juggle all of those priorities that the commission is trying to advance simultaneously? Does the FERC staff and the commissioners' offices, do they have the bandwidth for pushing forward on multiple fronts? I know that was a concern I always had when I was in different roles at FERC. So how do you see that all working out?
Oh, totally, and Larry, it's a concern we talked about, right? With this job, it has to be a concern. I was joking with someone over a lunch meeting today that I think I have the lowest hourly wage that I've had since high school with this job, which is obviously not quite correct, but probably more true than I care to admit. There's a lot on the commission's plate right now. And that is a function of having an ambitious chairman. That's a function, I think, in part of having a chairman who was a minority commissioner for 3 years and has seen a lot of things, knows and has seen a lot of things that he really wants to take on. And again, there's a dissent for that. For almost every one of these things, it's something that's come up in a prior proceeding. So I think the commission is sort of, my personal view, again, as all of my views, but in particular underscore here, is that the commission is really close to capacity. I don't think there's a lot of bandwidth to take on big new initiatives on top of the stuff that Rich has already announced, including transmission as one of those things. So I think that's one answer. There can't be a new initiative every month, and it was sort of taking up all the slack in the system. But I do think that there is capacity to handle the stuff that's already out there. And partly that's because, and I mean, this is the easiest thing to do, is to praise FERC staff, but FERC staff really is fantastic. I mean, the degree of dedication, the speed with which people can work is literally astounding. And I really also think there are a lot of people that are really excited to work on these specific issues and are willing to, I mean, there are a number of people that are willing to work after they put their kids to bed and stuff like that. I mean, it's not a recipe for success over years and years and decades and decades. You don't want people to always have to work outside their normal hours, but the extent to which people really believe in a lot of the stuff that's going on, and I obviously only hear from the people that agree with that, but the people are really willing to put in that time. I think we can handle the things that are on the commission's plate right now. I do think that you can't add much more to that plate without potentially risking burning out staff or sacrificing quality or other things that obviously would not be acceptable.
Well, I have to agree. I was always impressed by the commitment of the FERC staff over the year, even with personnel.
Working at the agency, hands down.
Yeah. Well, let me switch a little bit. I want to drill down on one of the particular issues surrounding transmission that the commission actually just addressed as of last week, which is some of the challenges associated with the division between federal and state jurisdiction over different aspects of transmission. As you know, the commission put out the order on the joint task force. I think there's a lot of curiosity around how that will wind up working going forward. And then one question I got from someone here says, what is the commission's vision on how the federal and state coordination will work, especially in a situation where transmission maybe supports one state's goals or reduces the costs, but then not so much for another state that the line has to traverse. How do you see those types of issues playing out?
Yeah, I mean, they're important issues, and I can't sit here and say I know exactly how they'll play out, but I have some ideas. With respect to the task force, I personally have really high hopes for the task force. I imagine most people on this call have either read the coverage or creating the task force itself, but the broad details are all 5 commissioners will participate. There'll be 10 state commissioners chosen largely in consultation with NARU. And there's a discrete set of topics identified, but they're all big topics and they're broad topics. So I think it gives the 15 participants on the task force a lot of leeway to work within. In terms of what it will do, I think there are sort of 2 big goals. One is because authority over transmission development is bifurcated, and because each sort of the feds and the states depend on each other to get anything done, I think getting the decision makers in a room and getting it the chance to just talk through what their priorities are, what their concerns are. I am a big believer in that kind of dialogue can be really useful. I don't think a dialogue in itself is just going to get transmission built. It's not like they'll all just talk to each other and suddenly transmission lines will spread up all over the country. But I do think there's a lot of potential to reduce the friction in the system that way and to hear what each other's concerns are. And it's the sense that you've been heard, the sense that you've been able to talk through something, and that whatever comes out on the state level, whatever comes out on the federal level reflects the other sovereign's concerns. I do think that can be meaningful in and of itself. In addition, though, I know that Rich has really high hopes for solutions to come out of this task force, that people who represent different perspectives can get together and I don't mean to debate them in an adversarial sense, but really talk through, hey, this is what the problem is. This is what we're concerned about on cost allocation. This is what we're concerned about on cost allocation. This works, this doesn't. That having that type of back and forth and sort of live dialogue as opposed to one that just takes place on cold pleadings can lead to solutions that are good in and of themselves, but also just as importantly, solutions that have buy-in. Because the states ultimately, by and large, overwhelmingly self-control siting, FERC dictating, hey, this is the way we're going to plan projects and this is the way we're going to pay for them. It doesn't mean that much if those projects can't get any of the permits they need to get developed. So having buy-in on identifying solutions that have buy-in, I think that is a really high potential aspect of the task force. You had a second part to the question there that I forgot.
You know, I was going to say, I thought it was it's a really potentially smart olive branch from FERC to state commissions on a number of levels, I think. And although the order didn't put in a huge amount of detail, it did lay out a framework for a process that would play out over the course of, say, the next maybe 3 years or longer. I guess, and I think people are hopeful or yeah, hoping that it can help smooth things along in terms of some of the issues. You know, maybe for those who may take more of a glass half empty potential approach, how do you keep that type of process from actually bogging things down or prolonging things more so than what we've got now? How do you keep everything moving rather than getting slowed down as this process engagement unfolds?
Yeah, I think the answer there is that it can't. This process has to be a forum for coming up with solutions, but it's not the only forum. And I know I was in on the talks that Rich was having with President Schlander and the other neighborhood representatives, and he was quite clear that FERC is going to continue to take a look at things and build records and do all the FERC-related stuff that they would do without a task force. And so the task force doesn't sort of become a break for a process or a veto, but that the task force can be a way of generating solutions to the things that FERC is concerned about, and a way of making sure that states get the microphone that they deserve and that frankly they command because of their stating authority. So that it really can go hand in hand, and that it just everyone I think understands that it's not a substitute for other things that FERC can do. And in my view, it has to do to ensure just and reasonable rates.
Well, I want to talk a little bit. Somebody's raised some questions here in connection with transmission and clean energy types situations. And one of them is, when talking about long-term needs, transmission has life expected cycle of as high as 60 to 80 years. And we know that from the track record of some of the assets that are still in service today. How does the commission look at transmission needs, or how should they look at transmission needs when you've got, on the other hand, solar projects that are about 20 years, offshore wind that's like, say, 25. In other words, a much shorter life cycle for some of those renewable energy projects, and then combined with capacity factors that are lower too. How do you look at the life cycle of those projects and their capacity factors versus the much longer life cycle for transmission? Any thoughts on that?
This is where I get to say, well, I'm a lawyer and that's an engineer's problem, but right, done. Next question. No, in all seriousness, I mean, I do think that those are really important things, and I think when Rich talks about like wanting to get a process out there to get views from everyone involved, it's on questions like that, questions that don't have an obvious answer. For my part, I think most of the transmission that's going to be, or much of the transmission that's going to be developed over the next 10, 15 years will be to access clean energy. And while I mean, a solar farm may have a 20 or 25-year lifespan, the sun's probably going to keep shining in that region after 25 years. And so if we're talking about accessing the great solar resources in the southeast, the southwest, the wind in the middle of the country, those resources, I mean, we'll see how bad climate change gets, but those resources probably will still be resources that are worth tapping and utilizing. Maybe at some point we'll have, forget what the last engineer I was talking about, maybe we'll all have cold fusion in our basements, but that seems like that's a long way away. And so even if a project's lifespan is 20 years, I'm guessing there are still going to be significant transmission needs in those resource-rich areas throughout the country, even beyond the life cycle of any particular project. Such that I think the transmission assets will still continue to provide a lot of value there. And that's particularly for the assets that access resources. The assets that move resources around, whether we're talking about connections between RTOs, that will probably remain valuable almost irrespective of what happens with the individual resource mix. You know, the transfer capacity is going to be valuable, whether we're using offshore wind, onshore, solar, whatever it is, the ability to move electricity around easily, I think will remain really important irrespective of what resource mix is.
Well, I got another question for you that kind of reflects our engineering and asset management kind of concerns that we're focused on. So it may stretch your legal experience a little bit here.
I'll do my best.
But it's given the clean energy and electrification future, and just generally the broadening of our transmission needs going forward. Do you have any sense on what the Commission's thoughts are on the challenges that we as an industry face on workforce development and manufacturing readiness in order to deal with some of this?
I don't have a ton of individual thoughts. I think one thing that's been really interesting for me, and one thing that I've got a lot of exposure to, is some of the work that's being done, the sort of industrial policy that's being done on the federal level and the state level. We've been providing advice to DOE, technical assistance to DOE on a bunch of things. They're really thinking about some of those questions, whether it's workforce development or advanced manufacturing or things like that that are needed to support a clean energy industry, including the transmission component. I think New York has done some really interesting thinking around offshore wind and how do you develop a master plan that includes the ports, that includes the workforce, that includes all of that stuff. So I don't really think there is a FERC perspective per se, because that really is outside our jurisdiction, but we've been involved in sort of within our lane in some broader processes to think about those needs, and it's really impressive what sort of different agencies within the Biden administration are doing, what a number of states are doing to make sure that we have the inputs necessary for a clean energy economy. But beyond that, that's way above my pay grade and outside of expertise as well, for that matter.
Well, let me pivot back to a question related to the state federal task force effort, because it's a great question, and I wish I'd asked it before we got off of that topic. But do you have any thoughts on how an organization like WIRES or our individual members who are transmission owners or potentially others, how can they support or get involved to the extent in that effort that's going on with the task force, and particularly given our perspective on needs related to infrastructure, costs to customers that our members are obligated to serve, things like that. Do you see opportunities for that? And if you do, how would that play out?
Yeah, I think there are two sets of opportunities. One, I think at some point, hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll all know who the 15 commissioners participating on the task force are. We already know about, or at least 4 of the 15 are right now. I think it's really important to go and talk to them. I mean, FERC commissioners have a long record of having open doors. WIRES obviously is a very well-known group within the commission corridor. So getting in and explaining both what you think the challenges are, but more importantly, in my view at least, what you think the solutions are. Something I like to say, something I go out of my way to try and say regularly, is it's really, really important when talking to commissioners' offices and commission staff to let us know what you think the solution to a problem is, not just, hey, this is an issue coming, but particularly this is what I would do about it. I see like sometimes I talk to outside groups, say, hey, well, we don't want to step on the commission's toes. It's ultimately the commission's responsibility to come up with a solution. That's true. But while commission staff is amazing, commission staff isn't all-knowing, and having industry expertise come in and say, hey, these are things that we think would help solve these problems that we're encountering, I think is really, really valuable. And it gives staff and commissioners things to think through. So I would do that with the commissioners. I would also do it with the federal commissioners, but I would also do that to the extent feasible with the state commissioners when their names are announced, and let them know what you think on the topics that will be covered in the course of the task force. The other thing I would say is the task force 209B, which is the statutory provision that the task force is based on, contemplates the development of a record from the task force. And what exactly that record is going to be used for is an open question, but it's a record that states can rely on. It's a record that FERC can rely on. So having seen the issues that the task force will cover, start thinking, I would urge everyone to start thinking about what evidence is useful to put in that record. Again, I think that will shape how the task force considers these issues, and most importantly, what solutions for those issues the task force comes up with. I usually think of a record in terms of substantial evidence, because that's the lawyer's job, but I really think helping to shape that dialogue between the commissioners, which I think will be very record-based, is a worthwhile exercise.
Great. I wanted to shift a little bit to something that I had mentioned earlier, and I think you had talked about briefly, which is Order 1000 and the competitive process. And the question here is pretty broad. Do you have any views on the Order 1000 competitive process, and particularly in the context, is it helping or hurting in terms of the length of time and getting projects built? And this sort of signals what the questioner thinks. Is there a faster way to encourage partnerships so developers can work together, especially on some of these long distance voltage lines? Any thoughts in terms of Order 1000, how the competitive process is working?
So I have yet to meet someone who works on transmission and doesn't have a thought about the competitive process, whether it's working or not. So I definitely have some. I want to underscore again that they're only my own thoughts. And I'm sure this is something that many people will bring up in front of the commissioners, and I don't want to come anywhere close speaking for them and the chairman in particular. But I do think it's a big question. That's definitely something that I had in my mind when I was talking about how do you ensure that which works in theory also works well in practice. I mean, competition makes all the sense in the world on one level. And I am grew up in a capitalist society. I really value competition. I think competition gets to good results more often than not. But I also think that you have to be sure that competition is actually, the competition is not an end in itself. Let me put it down. You have to be confident that it is producing those good results. And you can read a study by Brattle on the one hand that suggests you don't have enough competition, and that's the only problem, and a study by Concentric on the other that suggests quite the opposite. And I think that is an open question. I do think, I think it's worth, there are two questions about competition that are worth really thinking hard about. One is competition actually generating benefits? Obviously, that's sort of the initial question. If it is, then maybe it's worth pursuing. If it's not, well, that leads to a conclusion in its own right. And then sort of on top of that, even if there are benefits to competition, is competition structured properly such that it ensures that it maximizes the benefits that customers are getting? And I think the question about delay or the length that competition takes, and maybe also one about the incentives that competition creates, are ones that the commission should take, or at least should consider taking a hard look at. I don't know that it's the number one transmission question that the commission should look at, but what is competition doing in terms of actual development, putting aside how much I think probably most of the commissioners favor competition in theory. What is it doing to the actual development of the infrastructure that I think they all want to promote, is an empirical question that I don't think has a clear answer, and I think merits a hard look.
Well, I got my next question kind of goes back into your lawyer's hat aspect of your job. It's a little bit more into the legal wheelhouse, which is starting from a general proposition, just and reasonable rates under 205 and 206 involve some level of balancing by the commission between customer interests and then investor interests. And the questioner is interested in what your views are with respect to this balancing. The concern from the questioner is that, particularly from some of the commissioners recently, there seems to be a much greater emphasis on the consumer side as opposed to investor concerns. And they're curious as to how do you see that balance? Does that seem accurate, that there's more of a push towards addressing consumer rather than investor concerns? And what is the right balance to be achieved?
So I think the proposition that just and reasonable is a balancing act is 100% correct. It is not that the lower a rate, the more just and reasonable that rate. That's clearly not right. So I think, yes, 100% agree with that. I do think there is an important consumer protection component of the commission's job, and when the commission was created, and this is in statute, this is in case law, as a monopoly regulator, so there will always be a consumer protection sort of impetus in there. So in a sense, that will always be a big part of how the commission ensures just and reasonable rates, because it's designed as an institutional body to represent or protect customers, but it's not designed to just drive rates as low as possible. It's designed to do so in a way that's consistent with things like the open Bluefield standard, that's consistent with considerations about infrastructure development. And I think that's particularly important when we've spent the last 53 minutes mostly talking about transmission, and that an important goal of all the commissioners is to build the transmission infrastructure needed. Obviously, how that infrastructure and the developers and investors in that infrastructure are compensated is going to be a really important component of developing that infrastructure that I think the commissioners all want. So yeah, I think that has to be a really important consideration. Is it true that there's a greater focus on consumer protection issues now? I think there's probably some truth in that. I know that that is very important to Rich. And so maybe just him becoming chair has led to some additional, a couple of proceedings that are focused there, some additional rhetoric there. I don't mean rhetoric in a bad sense, some additional attention on the issues when the commissioners are speaking. But I also think it's a small sample size. I mean, Rich has been chair for 5 months at this point, and I think there are a lot of issues. There are a lot of things that he is thinking about that aren't just focused on driving down rates, quite the opposite, potentially in effect. And it's important to sort of, it will be important, I think, to look at the overall body of all the stuff the commission does that has effects on rates, not just particular proceedings. And I don't mean to suggest that the person who was asking that question was only picking out a few things, but I do think a lot of the consumer protection dialogue probably comes out of a few particular proceedings, and it's important to situate them in the context of everything.
Another question I have kind of goes back to this concept of needs with respect to transmission, and they're talking about it in the context of the drought that we're currently seeing across the West, which could result to losing access to hydropower, and questioning whether you think is there a case to be made for more transmission in light of the challenges we're seeing by that type of a weather-driven event occurring out west?
Yes, full stop. I think, as I said, I think transmission is going to play a huge role in developing a resource mix that helps to mitigate the worst effects of climate change. But we're already in a position where we're seeing the early effects of climate change, and where the resilience of the bulk power system in the face of climate change is going to be heavily dependent on transmission. And it's going to be different in different parts of the country. Hurricanes in the southeast, droughts, wildfires in the west, extreme cold in the plains, whatever the New England had a few years back, bomb cyclones in the northeast, any of those various things, I think transmission can play a role in helping people adapt. And as we expect to see more and more extreme weather, I think that makes a stronger and stronger case for transmission infrastructure.
Well, I want to ask one more question too, that kind of shifts again, but this one's focused on siting and permitting issues.
Yeah.
And I'm going into the Wayback Time machine, going back to 2005. Do you see any possibility of breathing new life into the provisions in EPAC 2005 regarding national corridors in light of the Fourth Circuit decision? Is there anything that's being thought about there, or any movement that you can see using that authority to try to help deal with permitting and siting issues?
Yeah, I think it's something that's worth a hard look and the commission will think about. The 216 authority that was put in EPAC 2005, I think a lot of this was before my time at the commission. I think it's the sense that it never worked great. Larry, maybe you probably know better than I do, the sense that it never worked great even before the Piedmont case. But I do think that it's something that's worth taking a look at. It's something that Rich has asked me to think about. And I mean, I think there will be a balancing there too, which is even if there is a way to breathe life into the theoretical statutory authority FERC has, do we think that developers are going to use that authority? Because I understand that the process, getting a corridor designated, then going through the permitting, then going through a state process, then waiting the mandatory cooling off period, and then getting FERC site determination is not a quick process. And I don't think 216 is something that NARUC and the state entities are particularly fond of. So I think there are things to be done. There are things that could be done to breathe light into 216. Whether the juice is worth the squeeze, so to speak, I think is an open question. And yeah, but so I think it's a discussion that we had what the answer is.
Well, Matt, we've gone 58 minutes and talked about transmission. And in all of that time, I did not bring up the supplemental NOPR dealing with RTO incentives. And I'm not going to ruin that record for this event, because I know you and I have talked about it a number of times. And you're going to hear more at the end of this week from Wires views on that.
I encourage, let me just say real quick on that, there, conversations have been good. I encourage everyone, including yourself, to come in and talk to all the commissioners about it. It's rulemaking, we can talk about it even outside the comments, and I think it's important for the commissioners to hear what everyone thinks, Wires members included.
Well, I'm not gonna belabor that issue any further on this, but I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us. This has been really interesting. As I suspected, we've got tons of questions that came in from a number of different people, and I appreciate your talking to us and your candor in terms of responding to this. And thanks again for your time. It was great getting a chance to hear from you.
Thank you, Larry, and I hope to see you and others in the real world maybe pretty soon, not just on the screen.
Hopefully soon. But that's going to bring today's Wires webinar session to a close. I want to thank Matt for joining us, and we will have one of these coming up hopefully in August. So thank you very much, Matt, and thanks everyone for participating.
Thanks, Larry. Take care.
Bye.